My name is Eric Jacobstein. I'm the Senior Advisor for the Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and Staff Director for USAID's Northern Triangle Task Force. Thank you to the Seattle International Foundation for inviting USAID to host this panel at this year's Central America Donors Forum. I'm joined by three notable authorities on Central America and regional migration management. Katie Tobin, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of the Transborder Directorate at the National Security Council, Ambassador of Guatemala to the United States, Alfonso Quiñones, and Andrew Seeley, President of the Migration Policy Institute. Before we get started, I'd like to remind the audience that time permitting, there will be a question and answer sessions, so please use the Q&A function on your screen to submit your question during the discussion or at the end. But first, I look forward to a conversation with our panelists about expanding legal pathways for individuals from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Let me provide some brief background from USAID before turning to our speakers for their perspectives. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to addressing the root causes of irregular migration and building opportunities for people to flourish in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. But the administration's holistic approach to Guatemala to migration also includes creating legal pathways focused on strengthening cooperative efforts to manage safe, orderly, and humane migration. Among these, legal labor pathways in our region can be a real win-win for both sending and receiving countries. They can fill labor gaps in the U.S. economy while expanding safe and legal seasonal work opportunities for Central Americans. In turn, these opportunities can help reduce irregular migration and generate hope for young people in the region. Many Central Americans, as we all know, want to remain in their home communities, but see no economic opportunities at home. By promoting temporary legal pathways and including a focus on robust labor rights, we can help reduce the economic pressure that's driving many to choose a vastly more dangerous journey north. Now, in terms of USAID's response, the Biden-Harris administration, as I noted, has made a clear commitment to increasing temporary work opportunities for Central Americans, laying out intentions in the collaborative migration management strategy that was released in July. USAID is an integral part of this effort and is keenly focused on expanding lawful pathways for opportunity in the U.S., focusing on robust labor rights. We're building the capacity of labor ministries in Guatemala and Honduras and a division of the foreign ministry in El Salvador as they work to increase the uptake of individuals participating in temporary work opportunities in the U.S. through H-2A and H-2B visas. As you may know, H-2A visas are for temporary agricultural work, while H-2B visas are for temporary non-agricultural work. I recently returned from Guatemala and Honduras, where the country's labor ministries are not only matching workers with employers, but also working hard to ensure that the rights of Central American workers are fully respected while they're on H-2A and H-2B visas. They've created new channels of communication directly with the workers in the U.S. to help remediate any potential issues that may arrive. Similar efforts on H-2 visas are underway at the Salvadoran Foreign Ministry. USAID is committed to doing our part in building the capacity of ministries in the region to increase the uptake of H-2A and H-2B visas. But we also hope that this effort can be internationalized and look forward to working with partners in the region and from around the world who could benefit from seasonal worker programs. So let me stop there so we can have a robust discussion on this issue. I'd like to start with Katie Tobin. Prior to joining the Biden administration, Katie served as senior advisor to the U.S. government on behalf of the UN Refugee Agency, and she also served as UNHCR's liaison officer to U.S. Southern Command. Katie's a real champion on legal pathways with whom we work very closely, and we're honored to have her join us today. Katie, if we could start with this, why do you think legal migration pathways are important in decreasing irregular migration, and what do you think are necessary elements and priorities for expanding these pathways?
Great, thanks so much, Eric. And just wanted to say at the top, thanks so much to the Seattle International Foundation for inviting me to be part of this panel, and especially to Eric Olson and Andrea Beltran. Really appreciate it. This is an issue close to my heart, something that I worked on even before joining the Biden-Harris administration. And as Eric outlined in his remarks, this is really at the core of the Biden-Harris agenda in Central America and increasingly for the whole Western Hemisphere. It's a real honor also to be on this panel with Ambassador Quiñones and Andrew Seeley, two people that I've been in touch with regularly and are critical to the success of the work that the Biden-Harris administration is seeking to do on this front. So maybe just to say that we really view legal pathways as our best and most humane way to be able to address irregular migration from Central America. it was memorialized, as Eric mentioned, in the collaborative migration management strategy that we rolled out in July. And the CMMS, the collaborative migration management strategy, is a companion to the root causes strategy. And I wanted to make that point because they're so closely linked. And so what we view is that in the long term, the solutions are really in the root causes. And, the hope is that the people in Guatemala and in Honduras and El Salvador would be able to obtain high-paying jobs and, meet all of their needs and the needs of their families in their own country, that they wouldn't be subjected to any violence or any other reasons that are sort of compelling so many people to leave today, that people would travel to the United States for tourism, to study, to visit family, but that they wouldn't, be needing to come to the U.S. For the reasons that they are. So the root causes is really where it's at. But in the short term, we know that there are people leaving in large numbers for a variety of reasons. And so the legal pathways is our short, medium-term measure to address irregular migration in a humane way. So, I think that maybe just to mention also up front that we think that this is a solution, sort of a tool for addressing irregular migration that is really getting a lot of momentum. And that's really encouraging to see. Not just the United States, but so many countries are recognizing that this is really the best way, that, enforcement at borders alone, deterrence messaging, these things are not going to really shift the paradigm. We have to provide an alternative. I wasn't able to attend myself, but a lot of my colleagues were down in Bogota, Colombia last week for the Migration Ministerial. We had, I think, over 15, maybe more like 18 or 19 countries that were represented. There was legal pathways was a top agenda item. So many countries reference this as something that's needed to address the sort of unprecedented displacement and irregular migration that we are seeing in the hemisphere today. So what is the theory of the case? To go back to Eric's original question, again, we see people leaving for a multitude of reasons. And so our goal is to match the drivers of migration with legal pathways that are responsive to it. So our focus is on, just in the last 10 months, has been on resuming the protection pathways that had largely been shut off under the last administration. One of the key ones for us is the Central American Minors Program. So in March, we resumed that program, and then we've expanded it so that more people qualify for CAM. We have also, taking measures as we are globally, but with a priority for this region on refugee resettlement and the protection transfer arrangement. And then, as Eric mentioned, we know that a lot of people are fleeing because of, lack of jobs, and the economies throughout the region have been, incredibly impacted by COVID. So looking at matching the large supply of labor, people that are motivated to migrate because they don't have a job or not able to feed their families, with sectors in the United States where we are actually seeing labor shortages in various tourism industries and in the agricultural sector. So how do we facilitate access to our H2 and our H2A and H2B programs so that, we can, it's a win-win, as Eric mentioned. And then the last piece, I think, is bringing other countries to the table, what we're calling internationalizing the labor migration response, recognizing that this dynamic of labor supply and labor shortage exists in Canada as well, Costa Rica, Spain, Germany, I'm just naming a few countries. And so we're seeing, how can we, again, facilitate the matching of people looking to work abroad, and then sectors in other economies where labor is needed. We see that as it takes a lot of work to set up those programs. It's not easy. I'm really grateful for the work that USAID is doing. Along with Ambassador Quiñones, and this really takes a lot of work by the host governments and the labor ministries, and then we're so committed to making sure that their labor protections are in place, ethical recruitment. So it's a tall order, but it's something we're really committed to doing. And then maybe just to say very quickly where we started from, just to sort of underscore why it's so challenging and why this is our short-term solution, but it's kind of hard to get at the results we want overnight. When we started in January, we were looking at a very nascent refugee resettlement program out of Central America that only yields hundreds of cases a year. One thing that I think people often overlook is because of COVID and decisions made by the last administration, we'd actually shut off consular processing. So, we had no people coming to the United States from Central America just under normal immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas. So people that were eligible to, come through a relative or things like that. So that was all shut off. We have a huge immigrant visa backlog. We can no ability to reunite with family under the Central American Minors Program that was also turned off. And then with the H-2A and H-2B, they existed, but I would argue that there was no real effort to actually engage employers in the U.S. about the opportunities to bring in workers from Central America, and that is critical. So that is like at the heart of the work that we're trying to do now, is to raise awareness and facilitate that matching, because there certainly were people registering and wanting to come, as the ambassador knows. So anyway, so that's where we started, and then we're working really hard to turn on the programs that were turned off and to expand the programs that already existed. And so happy to discuss further, answer your questions, and thanks again for the invitation.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. Next, I'd like to turn to Ambassador Alfonso Quiñones, the Guatemalan ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Quiñones brings with him a wealth of leadership experience in the hemisphere, including 15 years at the Organization of American States, where I first got to know him, and 5 years at the Inter-American Agency for Cooperation and Development. Most importantly for today's discussion, Ambassador Quiñones works hard day in and day out to seek seasonal work opportunities for Guatemalans in the U.S. Mr. Ambassador, over to you to provide some thoughts.
Muchas gracias, Eric. Voy a hacer mi presentación en español, reconociendo que una buena mayoría de las personas que están conectadas es el idioma que habla. Quiero agradecer a Seattle International Foundation y en particular a Adriana y a Eric Olson por organizar esta actividad, y a Eric de USAID por invitarnos y por llevarla adelante, porque es un tema muy, muy importante. Ya escuchamos a Katie y yo voy a hacer algunas otras reflexiones en relación con este tema. Yo creo que el punto de partida es que en el caso de Guatemala no queremos que nuestra gente se vaya del país. Sin embargo, tenemos que reconocer que hay algo que en inglés se ha dado por llamar el push factor, o ese factor de expulsión, y es muy fuerte, y ese push factor se compone de una serie de elementos, pero tal vez si lo pudiéramos sintetizar en uno sería la falta de prosperidad. Y hasta que logremos tener esa mayor prosperidad, la migración irregular no se va a reducir. Digo reducir porque la realidad es que nunca se va a acabar. Lo que tenemos que hacer es que la migración sea por elección y no por necesidad, y que sea ordenada, que sea segura, que sea regular y que sea humana. Es por eso que el presidente Giammattei ha señalado que la forma de reducir la migración es a través de la construcción de muros de prosperidad, no muros físicos, pero entendiendo la prosperidad no solo desde el punto de vista de la generación de empleos, que ciertamente es muy importante, sino también de otros elementos como la salud, la educación, la seguridad, el Estado de Derecho, el cambio climático. O sea, hay una serie de elementos que hacen parte de esto. En el caso particular de Guatemala, la mayoría de las personas emigran por temas económicos. Lo hace en su gran mayoría, repito, no solamente en busca de empleo. Entonces, la lógica nos dice que para reducir la migración, esos empleos de calidad deberían estar en Guatemala. Y hay esfuerzos, ciertamente, que estamos haciendo en ese sentido para atraer más inversión, incrementar el comercio, particularmente con Estados Unidos, que es nuestro principal socio comercial y principal inversionista. Pero esto es a mediano y largo plazo, y la realidad es que aunque tenemos que seguir trabajando para atraer esas inversiones, incrementar el comercio, algo que tenemos que hacer en el corto plazo, y es aquí donde se junta el push factor con el pull factor, ese factor de atracción que existe en Estados Unidos, es que además es una realidad por el hecho de que leí una estadística que hay aproximadamente 10 millones de empleos disponibles en Estados Unidos y hay solamente 8.4 millones de personas activamente buscando empleo. Y los anuncios para obtener empleo se han incrementado un 65% en comparación con los que teníamos el año anterior, en esta misma época. Y en la región la realidad es que hay una cantidad muy grande de personas que estarían dispuestas a venir a trabajar a los Estados Unidos y hacerlo de manera regular y no tener que tomar esos grandes riesgos que significa la travesía de llegar hasta Estados Unidos de nuestros países. Y tampoco, y algo muy importante, pagarle a un coyote para que los lleve. Aunque nosotros en Guatemala preferimos una reforma migratoria integral y que se le otorgue el TPS a los guatemaltecos acá en Estados Unidos, pero sabemos que eso está en proceso. Entonces, en lo que eso ocurre, hay que buscar otras vías. Y aquí entran las visas temporales de trabajo, conocidas como visas H2A para temas agrícolas y H2B para los otros temas, servicios, etcétera, etcétera. Nosotros lo vemos como un ganar-ganar. La realidad es que todos ganan empleadores, ganan trabajadores, ganan nuestros gobiernos. Aunque la realidad es que sí hay alguien que pierde, y son los coyotes, ya que les arruinamos el modelo de negocio, que ya dejó de ser millonario para convertirse realmente en billonario. Una matemática muy simple: si la cantidad de gente que está entrando todos los meses, si la mitad de ellos le pagan a un coyote aproximadamente $10,000, estamos hablando de más de $1 billón al mes solo en esa área. Y además, muchos de los empleadores en Estados Unidos están a un nivel de desesperación para conseguir trabajadores y les ha generado grandes problemas para poderlos conseguir. En las últimas semanas hemos visto, solo para mencionar algo, la disrupción en las cadenas de proveeduría. Y esto se da por falta de trabajadores en los puertos, falta de choferes, pilotos de los camiones, falta de las personas que descarguen la mercadería. Y en broma y en serio, hay personas que están diciendo que están preocupadas de que Santa Claus no va a poder venir este año y traer regalos porque este value chain tiene esta disrupción. Entonces, como este caso, podríamos citar otros: industria de la hotelería, restaurantes, trabajos agrícolas. Y en este caso de los trabajadores agrícolas, el otro día tuve una reunión en la Secretaría de Agricultura de Estados Unidos y me decían que calculan que el 40% de la fuerza laboral agrícola en este país es indocumentada. Y de hecho, la primera conversación de alto nivel que tuve al venir a ser embajador fue con el secretario de Agricultura. Esto fue en abril del 2020, la anterior administración, y fue para pedirme que tenía grandes urgencias de mano de obra para algunos agricultores que los estaban presionando, y que si no, las cosechas se iban a perder, y que qué podíamos hacer para solucionarlo. Entonces yo le decía que el tema obviamente pasa por nuestro país, pero no solamente. Hay varios actores que trabajan en este proceso y que tienen que trabajar bien para que se rindan los frutos. Obviamente los empleadores tienen que querer contratar, y los trabajadores quieren venir a trabajar. Esos dos los tenemos claros, que existen esos intereses. Pero además están nuestros gobiernos, y hay oficinas en cada uno de estos gobiernos. En el caso de Estados Unidos, se involucra Homeland Security, se involucra el Departamento de Trabajo, se involucra el Departamento de Estado, muy importante porque hay un tema consular, pero también hemos visto cómo, y ahorita nos lo ratifica Katie, la Casa Blanca ha reconocido la importancia que tiene este tema y abordarlo de manera integral, de tal forma que podamos sino abordar en el corto plazo el tema migratorio. Y además también está USAID, que nos ha dado un apoyo para lograr ser más eficientes como gobiernos en el acercamiento para los empleadores. ¿Qué hemos hecho nosotros desde nuestra área para ser más efectivos? Pues por un lado, hemos hecho lobby acá en Estados Unidos para que se reconozca el valor de este programa por parte de los distintos hacedores de política. Y también hemos mandado el mensaje que es importante reducir la burocracia que tienen que llevar adelante los empleadores que quieren contratar a trabajadores. Pero desde el punto de vista de Guatemala, hemos establecido un programa dentro del Ministerio de Trabajo dentro del Departamento de Movilidad Laboral para facilitar que los empleadores puedan encontrar trabajadores que sean idóneos, que sean calificados y que sea un programa transparente y que genere confianza. Y al hacerlo, nosotros poder promover a los trabajadores guatemaltecos. Además, ofrecemos una serie de servicios, la capacitación a los trabajadores, incluyendo sus derechos laborales que mencionó Katie, que es muy importante, exámenes médicos, certificado de buena salud, verificación de antecedentes penales y policíacos, apoyo para la obtención de pasaportes, vinculación con consulado de Estados Unidos en Guatemala para facilitar el otorgamiento de visa. Obviamente, todo esto lo hacemos sin ningún costo para el empleador ni para el trabajador, y hemos logrado, a través de un apoyo de USAID, creo que es importante reconocerlo, reducir el número de días en el que hacemos todo este proceso. En este momento tenemos registrados más de 40,000 trabajadores que están interesados en trabajar internacionalmente en 60 distintas áreas de trabajo. Estos los tenemos registrados y están listos y dispuestos para ir a trabajar a Estados Unidos, Canadá o a cualquier otro país. Y esta escasez de mano de obra, no cabe duda que está afectando la economía de varios países. Estados Unidos no es el único, y esto impacta la productividad y la competitividad. Y los programas de visas temporales de trabajo además tienen el valor agregado que ayudan a aliviar en el corto plazo la presión de migración irregular. Sin embargo, hay cuellos de botella sobre los que hay que trabajar para que el programa sea más efectivo y tengan los resultados que queremos. Y doy 5 recomendaciones y con esto concluyo, Eric. Primero, es importante facilitar los procesos burocráticos acá en Estados Unidos. Aunque no lo crean, hay burocracia en Estados Unidos. Y uno de los temas consistentes que escuchamos de los empleadores es este tema, y es un desincentivo para ellos. El otro tema, y Katie y Eric me han escuchado decirlo, es importante apoyarnos en el tema del transporte, porque eso también nos hace más competitivos. Entonces, buscar ahí soluciones creativas para poderlo hacer. Tercero, evaluar la posibilidad de permitir que hayan personas que han sido deportadas para que puedan accesar al programa de H2. Muchas de las personas que son deportadas tratan de regresar a los Estados Unidos. Si estas personas pudieran hacerlo de manera a través de una visa H2, creo que aliviaría también la presión, porque en este momento tienen limitación para poder obtener. El cuarto punto es que nuestros consulados tengan acceso a la información de dónde están ubicados los trabajadores migrantes para que podamos acompañarlos y verificar también las condiciones de trabajo en las que ellos están desempeñándose. Y quinto, creo que es importante definir de mejor forma qué se considera trabajo agrícola. De alguna forma, expandir la definición y reflejar mejor las realidades que se tienen, y también permitir que puedan venir por periodos más largos, en el caso de cultivos que se dan durante todo el año. Estas son algunas de las recomendaciones, y las hago también en función de lo que hemos escuchado de los acercamientos que hemos tenido con los empleadores. Muchas gracias nuevamente por esta oportunidad y qué bueno que estamos conversando de este tema.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Finally, I'd like to invite my good friend Andrew Seeley, the president of the Migration Policy Institute, to provide some opening remarks. Some context, last year, Andrew published the book, Building a New Regional Migration System, Redefining U.S. Cooperation with Central America and Mexico, which he co-wrote with his MPI colleague, Ariel Ruiz. Andrew's a go-to expert for all things migration for all of us here, and we're lucky to have him with us today. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's great. Ambassador, always great to see you. Keep in touch on these things. And Katie, congratulations for the work you've been doing on the collaborative regional management strategy. It takes a lot to change the way the inertia in government, the way it's done. But I think one of the things that has been original in this administration, and you and your colleagues at the State Department and PRM have been at the forefront of this, is trying to say this has to be a regional strategy, right? There has to be, we can't deal with migration at the border. We need to think regionally about this. And I know this is a commitment further up in the administration as well, but I know, between your office and the State Department and PRM, you had the pen on that, and that is, I think, an important contribution to the future of thinking of the American government about migration, hopefully beyond this administration as well. So, and thanks, of course, to Adriana. Congratulations, Adriana, for joining the Seattle International Foundation. We've known each other for many years. And of course, my friend Eric Olson as well. I'm going to start by talking about Mexico. And I realize we're talking about Central America here, but bear with me for a second. Let me talk about Mexico. There was a time when we had conversation about migration, it was all about Mexicans coming to the United States. vast numbers of Mexicans getting across the U.S. border. It was what dominated the U.S.-Mexico relationship. There were a few Central Americans, sure, but it was all about Mexicans coming to the United States. And that changed, right? In 2007, 2008, there is a bit of a blip this year, but it's something of a false blip because a lot of Mexicans are adults who are double and triple counted. So it's probably a slight increase of Mexicans trying to cross the border unauthorized. It's never stopped. It's always been about 150 to 200,000 a year. This year, realistically, it was probably last fiscal year was about 300,000, which is an increase, but it's a much lower number than we've seen in the past. It's a huge drop. And there are three things that changed in Mexico. One was that the economy improved over time. Actually, four things that changed. The economy improved over time, and not just income per capita, but also access to health care, access to education, and remittances of Mexicans who had traveled to the United States made a huge difference actually in development outcomes and in employment and in people's well-being in communities in Mexico, particularly in rural areas in Mexico. Secondly, were demographic changes. There were fewer children born over time, and so there was less pressure on jobs each year. And that actually matters a lot, right? And there's another demographic shift, which is more and more Mexicans move to cities over time, which is another way. Some people, yes, were going to the United States, but others were looking for opportunities in larger cities and did well and chose not to migrate abroad because they had opportunities within their country. Third, there were legal changes in migration. And the biggest one is exactly what we're talking about. It's the H-2 program. There are about 250,000 Mexicans who go each year to the United States on the H-2A, H-2B program. Almost all the H-2A program is Mexican, about 92%, about 2/3 of the H-2B program. The U.S. now has a de facto legal pathway for Mexicans to come to the United States as temporary workers rather than having to jump across the border fence, right? And that makes an enormous amount of difference. Not everyone will do it. Not everyone knows about it. Not everyone can get into it. But it makes an enormous difference in people's opportunities and their opportunity structure, what they think their choices are in whether they're going to migrate unauthorized or they're going to try and get into a line to be able to go legally. And add to that, in the case of Mexico, because so many Mexicans became U.S. residents, permanent residents, and citizens over time, because there were many Mexicans involved in IRCA, and then just over the years, people become regularized in all sorts of ways through marriage and work and all sorts of other ways in the United States. There's also a big legal pathway for Mexican citizens now through family reunification, which does not exist for Central America for the most part, right? So all this changed things. And the final thing, there were some changes in enforcement. And what enforcement does, enforcement rarely will stop migration from happening. We keep thinking border enforcement is how you stop migration. It rarely does that. But what it does do is channel people into the other legal pathways. So enforcement is not irrelevant, but it's only relevant if you have a legal alternative there, right? So that made a difference over time. Now, is Central America Mexico? Well, back in the 1990s, and Michael Clemens, by the way, who is a brilliant thinker on these issues and worked with a lot on this, always cites an article that Doug Massey wrote back in the 1990s saying, it's too late to figure out Mexican migration. It's underway, but start thinking about Central America because it's going to happen sometime in the next 10 years or so. And he was a little bit off in the number of years, but it happened, sure enough. We tend to think migration is a result of problems, and it is to some extent, there's no question, but migration is also a result of opportunities, right? And we should also think that migration is normal and natural, and it's something that we want to regulate. Right? Yes, some people are fleeing from things. I'll get to that in a second. Not all migration is the product of opportunity, but some migration is a product of opportunity and happens in societies around the world. You can look at Michael Clemens' work on this or Hein de Haas's work. Countries as they develop and yet do not have the base of opportunities for people to aspire to, but they have just enough money they can consider moving, will often choose to move. And that increases if they live near another country that has greater opportunities, and if the social networks develop, as they now have with many parts of Central America, for people to be able to move, lowers the cost of moving, right? It makes it easier for people to arrive, to get a job, to have somewhere to stay when they arrive. By the way, it's not true everywhere in Guatemala, right? There are places in Guatemala where very few people migrate, but there are other places where those networks are now very strong, right? And so it's very easy, or El Salvador, Honduras, where those networks have become quite strong. Now, Central America may not follow the same pathway. I think there are other issues, including rule of law issues and governance issues, which are distinct from Mexico, not entirely distinct, by the way, but smaller countries, probably historically weaker states than in Mexico. We could debate that. So things may not play out the same way. I'm not suggesting that suddenly in 20 years, all migration from Central America would stop. Things could play out in lots of different ways. And there certainly is much more need to think about forced migration and how you look at protecting people. But the basic principle remains the same. In the long term, some degree of development will change people's options. Some demographic changes. We already see this playing out in El Salvador, where migration has largely dropped, at least compared to Guatemala and Honduras, because it's a slightly older population and a more urbanized population already, will make a difference. And if we build legal channels now, it took us in Mexico until 2007, 2008. I mean, to really begin to create the legal channels, particularly the labor channels. We could actually make a difference. And so instead of thinking about migration as a process to stop, how do we think of migration as a natural process that needs to be managed in a way that it benefits people both in the country that people are leaving and the country where they're arriving, and hopefully creating circular migration, circular patterns where people can actually come and go, earn some money, but also return to their homes. To do this, and you've already heard ideas, so I'm just going to run through this quickly. I'm going to repeat a few things, but there are at least 6 things to think about. I mean, one is, how do you create the incentive for employers in the United States to look to Central America? The easiest is the H-2A program because it's not capped and because it's expanding so rapidly every year. But obviously H-2B matters in non-rural areas. And so it's important, and the government has some ability to dedicate slots to people in Central America, as they did in a very small way, but very much, with about a month and a half only of notice, but in this past fiscal year. But if it could be done a little bit earlier, it can be done a little bit broader, that's a possibility. But H-2A is obviously the huge opportunity. But how to get growers excited? How do you get other employers excited about this? And how do you make sure the bureaucracy, the ambassador mentioned this, does not get in the way? How can the U.S. government make sure, how can the Guatemalan government, and USAID has been working on this closely with the governments in some of the countries, including Guatemala. How do you make sure those governments have an ability to do recruiting, but also how do you make sure that the U.S. government doesn't get in its own way, in terms of processing people? Because it's very set in Mexico. So how do you make sure that it's competitive with Mexico? Secondly, how do you make sure that recruiting is fair? And I know Guatemala is looking at a law that will regulate recruiting, but I think that matters enormously, having regulations around recruitment, what is legal and what isn't legal, and what are the penalties for doing things outside of that, and making sure these are transparent and making sure they're findable matters. I'll come back to that in a second. Third is making sure that people actually have recourse to law while they're employed. This is something in which the consular network of the governments can play a role. I know the labor ministry in Guatemala has been doing work on this, as well as the consulates, but it's incredibly important. These are unequal relationships. There's no question about it. Employers, most employees on a temporary program are afraid to denounce abuses at work if they're asked to work long hours, or if they're asked to, work on a Sunday or do something dangerous. So there has to be a way of balancing that out. The consular network can do some of that, but there also has to be legal support in the U.S. for people who encounter real violations of law. Fourth, it's worth thinking about reintegration. One of the things, I actually went to a community in Chimaltenango the other day, over the summer, that where people go to the Canadian Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. And I was shocked actually by how developed these rural communities are, where people come and go. Because part of it is when people come and go, they continue to invest in their own farms, right? As opposed to people who leave and are gone for long periods of time, who might or might not, but they're not physically present. So people really do. Is there a way, and this is where USAID comes in also, are there ways that we help people who are in these programs also develop their own economic possibilities with the money that they earn abroad, right? Can we be strategic about that? Fourth, how do we make sure people know about the programs? This is a huge issue. How do we make sure that, someone in Huehuetenango or in Quiché or in Quetzaltenango in a rural area actually knows, even if you create the programs, even if they're employers, they're excited, how do you make sure those that might otherwise migrate know through unauthorized channels actually know there's a legal channel? Because that isn't going to happen naturally. So figuring out proximity, figuring out the migrant resource centers, for example, that Katie's worked on, that's a really key idea, or any other way, how you make this proximate to where people live. And finally, and I think this was mentioned either by Katie or Eric, is, how do you actually scale this up? The Canadians actually have more labor pathways than the United States. And right now, they have more visas for seasonal workers in Central America. So how do we make sure that the Canadians are a partner, that Mexico is a partner, that Costa Rica, to a small extent, Belize, how do we make sure we add these up in a way that there's actually some consistency? And also, do we, are there pathways between things? Katie mentioned CAM, Central American Miners Program, which is another kind of legal pathway, not a labor pathway, but a family reunification pathway. Between the protection pathways like refugee resettlement, can we create some sort of bridging here to see where people need to be? A lot of people have mixed reasons for migrating, but some people need a labor pathway. Some people really need protection. Some people already have family in the United States and would be eligible for CAM. How do we actually build these up in such a way that there's some scale that they begin to matter sooner rather than later? My final comment on this is, we're talking today about Central America, and I kind of threw Mexico in there because, I think Mexico is a good example to begin to think through some of the challenges of Central America. Not that they're equivalent. I think there's some notable differences with Central America, but there's some similarity. But there's also, I think, we should also begin to be thinking more broadly in the hemisphere about some of these challenges as well. And I know this has been an effort that Katie's been involved in and Eric's been involved in, but, there really is a need to begin thinking also, some of the largest displacement crises and migration movements are actually in South America and in the Caribbean. And so how do we begin to take some of this thinking, which is gestating now between Central America and Mexico and the United States and Canada, and also apply it more broadly? And I have an article that should be out in a couple hours in the New York Times that will actually talk a little bit about that and how we think of legal pathways, maybe in a more broad hemispheric way as well, and not just the US and Canada, but more broadly across countries. So thank you for the invitation to be here.
Great. Thanks so much, and look forward to reading that article. Let me get into a couple topics here, and audience members, please submit any questions via the Q&A session function as well. But I just wanted to get at one thing that was just mentioned. It strikes me, Andrews, you brought up, one of the biggest challenges here is simply getting the word out, both in the United States and internationally, about the impressive Central American workforce, essentially marketing their skills worldwide and demonstrating how their skills may be useful for employers. So my question is, Ambassador Quiñones and Katie, what more are you doing from a U.S. and Guatemalan government perspective to market Central American labor pathways? And Andrew, what more do you think needs to be done on this issue of simply marketing, getting the word out? Ambassador, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. Nosotros hemos estado activos en tres frentes para promover los trabajadores guatemaltecos. Uno es con el gobierno de Estados Unidos, donde y las distintas agencias, en particular en cada uno de los temas en los que ellos trabajan. Por ejemplo, la Casa Blanca, Departamento de Estado, en fin. Pero quiero destacar el apoyo que hemos recibido para poder hacer una mayor promoción que nos ha dado USAID. Nos ha apoyado en el fortalecimiento institucional del Ministerio de Trabajo para que podamos dar un mejor servicio a los empleadores y poder apoyar también a los potenciales trabajadores, como lo mencioné en mis intervención inicial. Y también para que podamos hacer una promoción del programa acá en Estados Unidos. Es interesante y el timing no pudo haber sido mejor. El día de ayer el embajador Bill Pope, el embajador de Estados Unidos en Guatemala, visitó el Ministerio de Trabajo, el Departamento de Movilidad Laboral, que es el responsable de este tema y se conversó sobre esto. Pero más allá de eso, la relación con el gobierno, que es importante, hemos tenido una cantidad importante de reuniones con el sector privado y también con otras asociaciones que nos pueden ayudar. Por ejemplo, la Asociación de Gobernadores o la Asociación de Gobiernos Locales, para que ellos a su vez puedan hacer la promoción en los distintos lugares de Estados Unidos. También hemos conversado con miembros del Congreso de los Estados Unidos, no solo para trasladar lo importante que es este programa y que se legisle en favor de facilitarlo sino también que se mantenga el espacio o la posibilidad para el gobierno de Estados Unidos de incrementar el número de visas H-2B, que en este momento lo tienen en cierto número, pero eso es una decisión legislativa y hay que mantenerlo. Y un tercer frente es con el sector privado. Hemos tenido reuniones con el US Chamber of Commerce, con la Asociación de Empleadores Agrícolas, la Asociación Nacional de Jardinería, la coalición se llama el Labor Task Force on H-2B, donde hay hoteleros, hay restauranteros, hay parques de diversiones, jardinería y otros gremios. Yo creo que al final esto es clave porque si no hay demanda, mucho podremos hacer en capacitar a los trabajadores, pero si los empleadores no son los que reaccionan, va a ser difícil hacerlo. Entonces, tenemos que trabajar en este frente y yo quiero agradecer el apoyo de USAID en este sentido para que podamos ser más efectivos.
Great. Thank you for that. Katie.
Great. Well, it's hard to follow the ambassador. He certainly has been such a great advocate for the program and really great at, figure out how do we address some of the barriers. I can say that from the U.S. government perspective, as many of U.S. agencies that are involved in the processing of an H-2A or an H-2B visa. So we've been really working, as an interagency to see how we can, better facilitate access to the program in Central America. We're working really close with the U.S. With USDA, Department of Agriculture, the Department of Labor, and we're working right now, knowing that one of the big growing seasons is about to come up. It's starting in December, and so having our agricultural department actually go out and do a lot of engagements with, with growers around the country, making sure people are aware of the program. Our Department of Labor making sure that employers have better access to information about how to bring on laborers from Central America and other places. So I think it's important that we have all agencies on board and working collectively towards making this happen. Andrew mentioned and the ambassador as well, some of the sort of unique barriers to Central America compared to Mexico, the travel costs, the fact that it's a new market. So we are looking at ways that we can address those through private sector partnerships, and then looking at how we can, because for the administration, labor protection is also such a key priority, and so how can we sort of achieve both simultaneously through, and USAID has been really on the forefront of that effort. So there's a lot of barriers that we need to address if we really want to get the numbers in Central America that we have been able to achieve in Mexico. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to you, Andrew, for any ideas on this.
I was going to say one thing, by the way, on that is there's a Farm Worker Modernization Act that is sitting in Congress right now that has bipartisan support. If that comes through, it would go a long way to addressing some of the concerns about labor issues in the United States. It's not a cure-all by any means, but it is, it is a step in the right direction. Hopefully that, we don't endorse legislation, so let me stop short of endorsing it. But let me say, it is one of those things that seems to have buy-in on both sides here that is, I think would go a long way to alleviating some of the concerns about labor rights and set up a virtuous circle of conversations, at least on the agricultural side, not on the H-2B side necessarily. But I do think it's important to address the labor concerns, both in transparency in recruiting and in how do you balance the unevenness of the employer-employee relationship in seasonal programs. That gives confidence. And by the way, in my conversations with employers, we talked to a lot of employers about this. I actually find that employers are particularly concerned about transparency. They're worried just from a bottom line perspective. I'm sure some are for ethical reasons, but others just from a bottom line perspective are really worried that they will be caught up having done, recruiting in an unethical way, and it's going to come back to haunt them legally at some point. So actually the transparency in recruiting matters. It was one of the three things that came up continuously that, bureaucracy was a big one that was there, that came up continuously as well. In the conversations, just making sure that things were as efficient as they would be, in the Mexican consulate, which they're used to dealing with, U.S. consulate in Mexico, which they're used to dealing with. And then just the question of what's the incentive to go to Central America, because they already have, connections in Mexico, right? I mean, they have workforce that they like, and they didn't see a reason. So I think part of the answer on that is I think the U.S. government has to be active at a fairly high level in saying why this is a strategic priority. And I know that's been a hard thing to do because there are so many things that are strategic priorities. But at some point, I think it matters for an Assistant Secretary of Agriculture or someone from the White House or someone. The State Department's probably less effective there just because constituency is not the U.S., not U.S. employers, right? I mean, it could be the Commerce Department, but someone on the U.S. government say, this is a strategic priority because it's about our relationship with Central America and it's about managing migration. We think you have a real opportunity, in terms of your business goals, but for us, it's important because it's going to allow us to manage migration in a way that helps migrants, helps people in the United States and begins to take what has been a political problem, and turn it into a real opportunity for people, right? I mean, and we need your help in this. And I think someone has to push that. What, the Guatemalan government and others have done, I know the Salvadorian government's done this as well, is important. I think it's great that people from the Guatemalan Salvadoran government are present with employers, but it's going to take, I think, the U.S. government also saying why this matters strategically to get to the next step.
Great. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of, going beyond U.S. and Central America here and the internationalization piece. Just more broadly, USAID works very closely with donors such as Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Israel, and Japan when we're talking about addressing the root causes of regular migration. While our work with donors has tended to focus on the root causes piece, there's certainly ample space to collaborate on the internationalization of legal pathways, as both Katie and Andrew referenced. Can you each speak to efforts with partners such as Canada on labor pathways and other legal pathways that are protection related, and what more can or should be done in this space? Maybe we can start with you, Katie.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think as Andrew mentioned, Canada really has set the bar high in terms of their efforts on their guest worker, temporary worker programs in Central America. We're actually, per capita, I think they bring in more workers, temporary workers than the U.S. has in their programs. But you can correct me, Ambassador, if there's lessons that we can learn from that. How can we collaborate? But then this idea of internationalizing that I mentioned before, my background is in refugee resettlement, working, and I think there's actually some interesting parallels you can look at in terms of like how we do refugee resettlement. When you have a refugee population, there's countries, various countries that will make annual commitments to take in refugees from a particular place. And then, there's a process by which people that then qualify for refugee status are, allocated to the different resettlement countries. And it'd be interesting to set something similar like that up when it comes to labor migration, to bring up many countries that are interested in buying in and having, making sort of formal commitments to offer labor opportunities, and to then create some sort of a clearinghouse, some sort of a way by which people that are interested in working abroad, who might otherwise be thinking about migrating, could go to a location, register, and then receive information and referrals to a wide variety of countries where they may be eligible to work. So these are the kind of ideas that we're throwing around, how by bringing many countries to the table, and so I think the migrant resource centers that we mentioned before, that's part of the collaborative migration management strategy as well, and something that we're setting up in Guatemala and Honduras, hopefully Honduras and El Salvador in the coming year. Those are locations that we might be able to leverage to internationalize the labor migration response, as well as protection pathways. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and key is political will, getting all the countries to come to the table and to make commitments. But I think we're really there. I think there's a recognition around the Western Hemisphere that we're facing unprecedented displacement and migration, and that we need to come together. I seem to be having some internet troubles. Sorry about that. I hope you guys.
We heard you, just a bit of a delay, but thank you. That's great. Yeah. Why don't we go to you, Andrew, next on this one?
There, I think this is, I think there's two ways. I mean, one is, how do you get different countries thinking of this collectively? Can Canada do a little bit more? Can Mexico do a little bit more, thinking beyond the immediate border region? Because Mexico has a great regional mobility with Guatemala, but in the southern area of Mexico, whereas the labor market opportunities are much more robust in the center and north of Mexico. So are there ways we can think creatively about this? Can the European Union dive in? We're doing some work on this right now. A colleague of mine, Chris Ramon, with Ariel Ruiz, are looking a little bit at some of these other alternatives. Costa Rica has been, active with some other Central American countries, as well as receiving lots of Nicaraguans and Venezuelans. So one is that, can we expand the pathways that exist? The other is how we tie them together, right? I mean, getting to scale, part of it is increasing the actual numbers of people, but part of it is also, allowing people to sign up in one place for lots of different things. Right. I mean, in that, I think the idea of the migrant resource centers are interesting. I think there's a lot in the devil's in the details on this, right, of how it works out. I don't think it can be just a place where people come to learn how to leave their country. It has to have a component also, and the ambassador and I have talked about this a bit, it also should be about how people have opportunities in their own country, right? I mean, what are the training opportunities, the educational opportunities they can pursue? I think it has to be more holistic than just a information on migration, but to the extent that people probably will walk in there wanting to know about opportunities for migrating legally, it is, and that probably will be the reason people walk in the door. How do you actually have information on the U.S. program, the Canadian program, the Mexican visa, regional visa, to whatever extent there is something in the EU, what is the range where you begin to bundle these things together so people have, it's not just that some people know how to get into the Canadian program and other people know how to get into the US program, and someone historically, this is how we do things now, right? Someone historically knows how to go to Mexico because their family's always done that. Someone started in a village to go to Canada, and now suddenly people are able to figure that out. And maybe someone started to go to US in the small numbers. And how do you begin to bundle this together so there's some actual possibility of scale, and you can actually get on more than one list at the same time in a way that gives you a real opportunity to think that you have a future here. So, and then beginning to bundle a little bit with CAM and with protection pathways in subtle ways, so that at least some people can be identified that may not qualify for a labor program, but they may in fact qualify for something else. So I think that thinking of scale matters. Let me throw out one other thing, which is not my idea. It's actually Beth Ferris's idea from Georgetown. But also, how do we think about care work? I mean, one of the biggest needs in the U.S. economy and the Canadian economy, and at some point probably the Mexican economy, which is sort of moving towards upper middle income as well, with lots of poverty, but as a general proposition, moving towards upper middle income. Not saying most people are, but the economy is. Is care work. And we don't have anything right now in statute that allows us to allow people to migrate for periods of time for care work. But it would behoove us at some point to have that conversation, because I think there's a real opportunity. In fact, what do people do who are undocumented, particularly women, right? Because most of the labor pathways are for men right now. So when we think about what happens when people don't take these legal pathways because they don't know about them and there aren't very many of them, and they go undocumented, where do they end up working? They end up working in construction, agriculture, all those places that you can actually get into with an H-2A, H-2B, right? So we have a solution there. But for women, it's often care work of various forms, right? And we do have a pathway for nurses, but we don't have for doctors, but we don't have a pathway for that wide range of people who are in all sorts of everything from childcare to elder care, and everything else around it, other kind of sort of home medical services that aren't exactly require a nurse. There's a lot of sort of that middle skill area that we should be thinking about. So I realize none of us can solve that right now. That's a U.S. Congress issue and a Canadian Parliament issue, but it is something we should start talking about.
Thanks, Andrew. Ambassador.
Canadá ha sido para nosotros un socio muy importante, y de hecho el número de visas de trabajadores que van a Canadá es casi el doble de los que vienen a Estados Unidos. Y creo que es interesante ver el modelo canadiense para ver qué es lo que ha funcionado y cómo podemos replicar algunas de esas cosas que efectivamente han funcionado. Pero no son los únicos países. De hecho, nosotros hemos estado haciendo acercamientos con otros países en Europa. Les doy dos ejemplos. El día de ayer, el canciller estaba en Roma y se reunió con el ministro de Relaciones Exteriores de Italia y se acordó o anunciaron más bien la inclusión de Guatemala dentro del programa del decreto FLUSI, que permite ir a trabajar a Italia de manera temporal. Es su H2 italiano. Recientemente tuvimos una visita de Alemania en Guatemala. Ellos estaban buscando reclutar 80 enfermeras. Sin embargo, nos encontramos con una limitación, que no era el tema del idioma, sino era realmente el tema de la validación de títulos. Entonces, ese tema también hay que ponerle atención. Y yo creo que hay oportunidades interesantes donde puede haber apoyo para hacer esos programas más efectivos y trabajar con nuestras instituciones que dan capacitación. En el caso nuestro es el Instituto de Tecnificación y Capacitación de los Trabajadores, e incorporarlos dentro del proceso, por ejemplo, de los centros de recursos, del Resource Migrant Centers, para que ellos también estén participando ahí. Y tal vez trabajar para hacer una prospección donde podamos identificar cuáles pudieran llegar a ser los trabajos que van a estar en mayor demanda y enfocarnos en la capacitación en ese sentido. Yo quiero hacer eco de lo que decía Andrew del CARE, de las personas que pueden venir a apoyar a muchas personas que están al nivel de la desesperación, tienen un pariente con Alzheimer, tienen una persona ya de mayor edad, en fin, yo creo que ahí hay mucha oportunidad. O por ejemplo el tema de los conductores de camiones. Que ahorita es un gran problema, no solo en Estados Unidos, sino en Inglaterra, y hemos visto que incluso hasta querían involucrar al ejército para que manejara los camiones. ¿Qué tal si ponemos, sabiendo que eso existe, unos simuladores para que puedan practicar? En fin, hay algunas ideas ahí y creo que vale la pena irlas explorando.
Thanks so much, Ambassador. I know we're short on time here. I wanted to get a question from the audience. We had a couple of questions, Ambassador Quinones, for you on recruitment and communication. Specifically, Kathleen Karen asked about Guatemala's recruitment regulations, which she notes have been stalled. Could you speak on when that will be enacted and how both the U.S. and Guatemala can work to address fraud and abuse in the recruitment process?
Ese es un tema muy importante y estamos trabajando para hacer efectivo que sea de la forma que tú lo describes y que ella lo describe. Entonces, estamos trabajando para ponerlo en funcionamiento en Guatemala, porque de lo peor que puede suceder es que los trabajadores con muy buena voluntad sean explotados. O sea, ya los explotan los coyotes, los que quieren venir a trabajar, a venir de manera irregular. Si hay reclutadores que son también inescrupulosos, lo pueden hacer. Quiero mencionar también algo que estamos trabajando con el Departamento de Trabajo de los Estados Unidos, y es la firma de unos documentos que van en este sentido para el respeto de los derechos de los trabajadores acá. Una declaración conjunta reafirmando el compromiso de trabajar juntos para informar a los trabajadores guatemaltecos en Estados Unidos sobre sus derechos laborales. Una carta de entendimiento en relación con las protecciones de seguridad y salud en el lugar de trabajo aplicables a los trabajadores guatemaltecos en Estados Unidos. Y un tercero, que es una carta de entendimiento relativa a las leyes y los reglamentos sobre salarios y horas aplicables a los trabajadores guatemaltecos en Estados Unidos. O sea, hay un compromiso tanto del gobierno de Estados Unidos como el gobierno guatemalteco de trabajar en favor de proteger los derechos de los trabajadores que vienen a los Estados Unidos.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I think that's unfortunately all we have time for today, but this is really, given me at least a lot of food for thought. So appreciate the panelists' great comments and thoughts on all this. And again, just want to thank the Seattle International Foundation for providing the space to us to have this conversation.